Overnight in Washington, the first reports crossed. North Korean ballistic missiles had struck a Ukrainian city, and Zelenskyy was naming the supplier on X. By dawn, a Damascus court had sentenced its former president. A Houthi missile had hit a Red Sea freighter. Seoul had refused to send weapons to Kyiv, and Ukrainian drones were burning a Siberian petrochemical plant. One day, 5 theaters, and the thread that ties them together is escalation. We start where the missiles landed. What does it mean when the ballistic missile over Zaporozhye is not Russian-made? It means the war just imported a new supplier, and that supplier is North Korea. Overnight, Russian strikes hit cities across southeastern Ukraine, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says the attack on Zaporozhye was carried out with North Korean ballistic missiles, alongside Zircon hypersonic weapons and guided aerial bombs. In a post on X, Zelenskyy writes that emergency crews have been working since last night to deal with the aftermath, and he names the weapons explicitly: North Korean ballistic missiles, Zircons, and guided aerial bombs. Local authorities in Zaporozhye say the strike left 6 civilians lost, while officials in Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk report another 6, and the Associated Press puts the overall civilian casualty count at least 9. The BBC, citing Ukrainian claims, reports that the Zaporozhye strike involved ballistic missiles supplied by Russia's ally, and The Independent corroborates the North Korean missile angle. Zelenskyy is using the strike to make a political argument as well as a military one. He says Russia cannot wage this war without North Korea, and he is warning Asian democracies that the Axis is not a European problem alone. What is still unverified is the exact missile model, likely a KN-23 or KN-24 variant, the launch site, the number of rounds fired, and any independent forensic confirmation of North Korean origin, because so far the public evidence rests on Zelenskyy's statement and the wreckage his teams are collecting. The Russian Ministry of Defense has not confirmed the use of North Korean missiles, and its own claims about the night's targets remain unverified. Why this matters is not just the casualty count in one city, it is the supply chain behind the blast. Russia has been running short of precision ballistic missiles for more than a year, and every North Korean round that reaches a Ukrainian neighborhood is a round Moscow did not have to build itself. That matters for the front line, because Ukraine is already stretching its Patriot and Iris-T inventories across multiple axes, and Euronews notes that a shortage of PAC-3 interceptors has worsened since the United States and Israel opened their war with Iran in February. The wider effect is a bidding war for interceptors. Every battery sent to Ukraine is one that NATO planners would rather hold in Poland or Romania, and every North Korean shipment that gets through forces allies to choose between protecting Ukrainian cities and covering the eastern flank. The economic ripple is equally concrete. Defense procurement timelines in Europe and the United States are shortening, and shares of missile defense contractors are moving because investors now see demand that outlasts the current war. What the strike signals is an escalation in dependency, not just in firepower. Russia is treating North Korean missiles as an interchangeable substitute for its own Iskander and Kinzhal stocks, which tells us Moscow's industrial base is no longer keeping pace with its operational plan. It also tells us Pyongyang is getting real-world test data and combat validation for its ballistic missile force, which is worth far more to Kim Jong-un than the cash or fuel he is reportedly receiving. The trajectory points in one of two directions. If the North Korean pipeline keeps flowing, Russia can sustain or even expand ballistic barrages against Ukrainian cities, especially as winter approaches and the energy grid becomes the target set. If the United States, Germany, and South Korea respond by surging interceptors and isolating the arms route, the Axis itself becomes a diplomatic pressure point, and Moscow may have to choose between preserving its relationship with Pyongyang and limiting new sanctions. The clearest sign that distinguishes the two paths is Seoul. If South Korea shifts from humanitarian aid to lethal support, the cost to Russia of using North Korean missiles rises sharply. And while Ukrainian rescue teams work through the rubble, the day's second shock is a courtroom in Damascus. How do you sentence a man who is sitting in Moscow? That is the question, after a Damascus court convicted former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad of crimes against humanity during the country's civil war and issued a capital sentence, the first verdict against him since he fled to Russia in 2024. The New York Times reports the ruling on Tuesday, and it marks a sharp turn for a leader who once treated Syria's judiciary as an instrument of regime power. The court's decision comes from the new authorities in Damascus, who have been trying to transform a revolutionary victory into a functioning state, and it lands at a moment when Russia is still hosting Assad in exile and operating its naval and air facilities on the Syrian coast. What is confirmed is the verdict and the sentence. What is unverified is nearly everything that comes after it. We do not know whether the sentence is final or subject to appeal, whether Damascus will formally demand Assad's extradition from Moscow, or whether Russia will even acknowledge the ruling. The Kremlin has given no sign it intends to hand over a former client who received asylum, and Assad himself has not appeared in public since his flight. The trial details, defense lawyers, evidence standards, witness testimony have not been released, so independent legal assessment is impossible for now. Why this matters is that Syria is attempting to build a post-war legitimacy narrative around accountability rather than revenge. A capital sentence against Assad, even if it cannot be carried out immediately, signals to refugees, to the Gulf states, and to Western capitals that the new government is willing to confront the old regime's record. The wider effect is diplomatic. Every Arab state that has moved toward normalization with Damascus now has to calibrate its position against a court that has ordered the capital punishment of a man Moscow is protecting. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar have been inching back toward Damascus, partly to limit refugee flows and Iranian influence, but a live capital verdict against Assad complicates any red carpet return. The economic ripple is reconstruction. Western sanctions relief and Gulf investment depend on a stable, predictable Syria, and a high-profile capital verdict could either accelerate justice-based normalization or freeze it. For millions of Syrian refugees in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, a verdict against Assad is a precondition for even considering return. But a verdict that cannot be enforced is a reminder that justice and power are still not the same thing. What the ruling signals is a doctrine shift in how post-Assad Syria uses its institutions. Instead of summary violence, the authorities are using a court, which is a bid for international credibility and domestic control at the same time. It also puts Russia in a bind, because Moscow wants to keep its Tartus and Hmeimim bases more than it wants to keep Assad, yet handing him over would look like a betrayal of every client regime it has sheltered. Moscow has already lost its influence over most of Syria's interior. Losing the bases would leave Russia without a warm water naval foothold in the Mediterranean, which is why the Kremlin is likely to stall, offer quiet concessions, or propose a face-saving tribunal rather than surrender Assad. The trajectory branches from here. One path is symbolic. Assad stays in Russia, the sentence remains on paper, and Damascus uses it as leverage in talks about Russian base rights and sanctions. The other path is confrontational. The new Syrian government demands extradition, Moscow refuses, and the dispute becomes a test of whether Russia can still hold onto its last Mediterranean foothold. The clearest sign that distinguishes them is the Russian Foreign Ministry's next statement on Assad's status. From a verdict in Syria, we go to a live shipping lane, where the Houthis just drew devastation. When was the last time a Houthi missile took the lives of merchant sailors? The answer is Tuesday, according to Yemen's government, which says a Houthi strike on a cargo ship in the Bab al-Mandeb Strait left at least 6 people lost. The New York Times reports, the ship was carrying food supplies to a port on the strait when it was hit, and it notes that the Iran-backed Houthis have not commented on the attack. Other outlets put the casualty figure lower. Forbes, citing Reuters, reports 3 people lost, and CNA reports 4 crew members lost, including 3 Pakistanis and 1 Indonesian. The discrepancy is unverified, and the ship's name, flag, and exact position have not been independently confirmed at the time of this briefing. What is confirmed is that the strike produced crew casualties, which is a threshold the Red Sea crisis had not crossed in this phase of the wider Middle East war. Since the Iran war began in February, Houthi attacks on shipping have harassed vessels, forced reroutes, and raised insurance costs. but the Bab al-Mandeb had not seen crew members lost to a Houthi missile until this incident. That makes the event more than a maritime incident. It is an escalation in the use of shipping as a weapon. The wider effect is economic. Every crew member lost in the strait pushes war risk premiums higher, and higher premiums push more container lines and LNG carriers to divert around the Cape of Good Hope. That lengthens transit times, raises fuel costs, and tightens global supply chains at a moment when the Hormuz route is already under strain. Egypt loses Suez transit fees with every diversion. Saudi Arabia and Israel watch the southern Red Sea nervously, and European importers face longer lead times for Asian goods just as the summer shipping peak continues. The energy market effect is immediate in the forward curve, even if spot prices have not yet spiked, because traders price the risk of a sustained closure, and any LNG carrier diversion tightens European gas balances before winter. What the strike signals is that the Houthis retain a capable missile force and are willing to use it against commercial traffic, despite months of US and British strikes on their launchers. It also suggests that Iran is still feeding the group enough targeting data, components, or political cover to keep the Red Sea hot, even as Tehran negotiates with Washington over Hormuz. The attack also comes at a moment when Tehran is publicly negotiating with Washington over Hormuz, so a Houthi escalation in the Bab al-Mandeb may be a way for hardliners in Iran to complicate any deal their own diplomats are discussing. The trajectory from here has two branches. One path is military. The U.S. Central Command and its partners treat the crew losses as a red line and expand strikes on Houthi radar, missile depots, and launch sites in western Yemen. The other path is bargaining. The Houthis keep the strait dangerous as leverage, while Iran and the United States edge toward a wider arrangement, using the threat to shipping as a chip at the table. The clearest sign that distinguishes them is whether the Houthis claim the attack or stay silent. A claim usually signals escalation for propaganda, while silence often signals a calibrated move in a larger negotiation. Either way, the strike proves that the Houthi threat to shipping is not a spent force, and that the Red Sea remains a live front even when headlines are focused on the Gulf. The Red Sea is not the only place where allies are drawing red lines today. Next, Seoul. If North Korean missiles are falling on Ukrainian cities, why is Seoul still saying no to bullets? The answer came Tuesday from South Korea, which says it will not provide lethal military aid to Ukraine despite the deepening military cooperation between Pyongyang and Moscow. Mili Tarny reports the statement, and it arrives the same day Zelenskyy warns that Russia cannot wage its war without North Korean support and appeals to Asian democracies to recognize the threat. Seoul's position is not new, but the context is. North Korean troops are already reportedly operating in Russia's Kursk and Voronezh regions, and North Korean ballistic missiles are now being used against Ukrainian civilians. What is confirmed is the South Korean government's public stance. Humanitarian support continues, lethal weapons stay off the table. What is unverified is the exact size of the humanitarian package, whether intelligence sharing or non-lethal equipment transfers have quietly expanded, and whether the decision is being driven by domestic politics, military caution, or pressure from Beijing and Pyongyang. South Korea is one of the world's largest arms exporters, with deep stockpiles of artillery shells, infantry vehicles, and air defense systems that Ukraine would immediately use, so the refusal is not a capacity problem, it is a political choice. Why this matters is that Seoul is drawing a bright line between helping Ukraine and directly engaging in a war that involves its main adversary. The calculation is straightforward. Any South Korean weapon used against North Korean troops in Ukraine could be used by Pyongyang as justification for escalation on the peninsula, and Seoul does not want to give Kim Jong-un a pretext to test that logic. The wider effect is on alliance burden sharing. The United States and Japan want South Korea integrated into a more muscular Indo-Pacific support line for Ukraine, but Seoul is signaling that its first obligation is deterrence at home. The economic ripple is in defense procurement. If Seoul stays out of lethal aid, Warsaw, Berlin, and Washington will have to fill the shell gap, which keeps NATO production lines at full throttle and keeps South Korean contractors from capturing the wartime market they are otherwise built to serve. At the same time, Any hint that Seoul might change course moves the won and the share prices of Korean defense firms, because investors know that a green light for Ukraine would open a massive new order book. What the stance signals is a doctrine of calibrated separation. South Korea will cooperate with NATO, host summits, share intelligence, and sell weapons to Poland, but it will not let its own munitions become the instrument used against North Korean troops in Europe. That is a message to Pyongyang: we are not crossing this line, and to Washington: we are already carrying a heavy load on the peninsula. The domestic politics are equally delicate. Yoon Suk-yeol's government faces a public that is wary of entanglement in Europe and an opposition that would seize on any move that appears to risk peninsula stability. The trajectory has two branches. One path is steady state. Seoul expands humanitarian aid, medical supplies, and demining gear while keeping lethal aid off the table, using the crisis to deepen its role in NATO's Indo-Pacific dialogue without firing a shot. The other path is pressure-driven, a major North Korean provocation, a direct U.S. quest, or a shift in South Korean public opinion after a high-casualty strike could push the National Security Council to approve indirect lethal support, such as shells routed through a third country. Seoul's refusal leaves the battlefield to drones, and tonight those drones reached Siberia. What happens when a drone can reach the factories that feed Russia's entire petrochemical chain? On Tuesday, Ukrainian long-range drones reportedly struck Russia's largest petrochemical plant, located in Tobolsk in western Siberia, more than 1,500 kilometers from the front line. The Moscow Times reports the attack on the Sibneftekhim complex, and the BBC separately notes that Ukraine hit a Russian refinery at roughly that distance overnight. Meduza has begun analyzing satellite data to assess the damage, which is the only way to verify claims when both sides control the narrative. The plant is a cornerstone of Russia's petrochemical sector, producing polymers used in tires, packaging, and industrial components that also support defense manufacturing. What is confirmed is that Ukraine is conducting long-range drone strikes deep inside Russia, and that a major petrochemical facility in western Siberia was hit. What is unverified is the extent of the damage, whether production has been halted, how many drones got through, whether there were any casualties, and whether the target was the Tobolsk complex or another nearby facility. The plant's exact layout and the location of the impact within the complex are also unknown, which matters because a hit on a distillation unit would shut down production for months, while a hit on storage tanks would be dramatic but easier to repair. The Russian Ministry of Defense says it intercepted dozens of drones, but independent confirmation is lacking, and Ukraine's general staff has not released a detailed battle damage assessment. The exact drone type is also unconfirmed, though the range points to a modified jet-powered or propeller-driven platform, with satellite navigation and possibly Western components. Why this matters is that the strike extends Ukraine's reach into Russia's industrial rear in a way that was not possible a year ago. When a drone can fly 1,500 kilometers and hit a plant that supplies the Russian economy with basic chemicals, every refinery, pipeline junction, and polymer plant west of the Urals becomes a potential target. The wider effect is economic. Petrochemical exports are a key source of hard currency for Moscow, and sustained strikes on the sector could tighten global supply of certain plastics and fertilizers, while forcing Russia to divert air defense systems from the Ukrainian front to protect Siberian infrastructure. The defense procurement ripple is equally important. If Russia has to protect its rear with Pantsir and S-400 batteries, those systems are not protecting frontline troops or ballistic missile launch sites. The strike also has a signaling value for global markets. It shows that distance is no longer a reliable defense for Russian energy infrastructure, and that any facility within roughly 1,500 kilometers of Ukraine is now on a target list that includes refineries, pipelines, and chemical plants. What the strike signals is a shift in Ukraine's campaign from symbolic long-range attacks to systematic pressure on Russia's fuel and chemical spine. It is also a capability reveal. A drone that can reach Tobolsk can reach dozens of other industrial cities, and that changes the risk calculation for any facility that thought distance made it safe. One path is defensive adaptation. Russia pulls short-range air defense and fighter patrols away from Ukraine to guard the Urals and the Volga basin, which slows its offensive tempo and gives Ukrainian forces more room to maneuver. The other path is escalation. Moscow treats the Siberian strikes as a strategic threat and responds with heavier missile barrages against Ukrainian cities or with new red lines for any state supplying drone technology. The clearest sign that distinguishes them is where Russia moves its next air defense battalions. If satellite imagery shows S-400s redeploying eastward, the defensive adaptation path is real. We will watch the satellite imagery overnight, but here is what to watch in the next 24 hours. First, watch whether South Korea's National Security Council changes its language on lethal aid after Zelenskyy's direct appeal to Asia. Second, watch for the first independent satellite imagery of the Tobolsk petrochemical strike, because it will tell us whether Ukraine's deep strike campaign is doing lasting damage or just making headlines. Third, watch the Bab al-Mandeb Strait for a Houthi claim or a U.S. Central Command response, since the crew casualties turn a shipping risk into a potential military trigger. Fourth, watch Moscow's reaction to the Assad capital sentence, because Russia's answer will shape whether Syria's new government can enforce its verdict or whether it remains a piece of paper. If this briefing helped you make sense of a fast-moving day, hit the like button, subscribe the channel, and tap the bell so you never miss a daily update. We will be back tomorrow with the next 24 hours. See you tomorrow.